Hi, colleagues. My name is Maria Terskova, and I'm going to present you my topic, which named Infrahumanisation Theory Meta-Analysis. We conduct this with Elena Gadulina. So, basically, Infrahumanization is a process by which people consider their in-group as fully human and out-groups as less human and more animal-like, and the theory was proposed by Lyons. And he divided emotions into primary and secondary. Primary emotions experienced by both animals and humans, like fear or anger, and secondary emotions experienced only by humans. These emotions are unique to human beings, like hope, shame, or sorrow. And there are three main theses of Infrahumanization theory. Firstly, that attribution of primary emotions does not imply differences between in-groups and out-groups. So people tend to attribute equal number of emotions to the primary emotions, to the in-group and to the out-group. Secondly, that individuals are more likely to attribute secondary emotions to the members of in-group than out-group. And thirdly, that individuals attribute both positive and negative secondary emotions to the in-group more than to the out-group. So he proposed that the uniqueness of emotions is matter, and people tend to attribute more secondary emotions regardless of their valence to the in-group than to the out-group. But the valence is important information, and some other effects can be fixed using the methodology of attribution of emotions, which included not only primary and secondary emotions, but also positive and negative emotions. For example, we can propose that in-group favoritism or out-group negativity effect can be fixed. For example, if individuals attribute more positive emotion, regardless of the uniqueness of these emotions, but more positive emotions to the in-group because we want to consider our group as the best group and save our positive identity. Or we can talk about valence effect. Positive information is more homogeneous and related to each other. And people can choose more positive emotions regardless of the groups, regardless of the uniqueness of these emotions, just choosing more positive emotions than negative because positive emotions more related to each other. Also, we can speak about stereotype expectations. For example, if we think that old people are certainly lonely, we can attribute more negative emotions to this group than to the group of young people. And familiarity effect, we maybe can attribute more emotions at all, regardless of the uniqueness, regardless of the violence of this emotion, more emotions to the in-group than to the out-group because we know our group better. And we want to check this effect by meta-analysis. So we found articles by keywords: Infrahumanization, dehumanization, primary and secondary emotions, and only 40 articles matching selected criteria. There are used researchers in these articles used the methodology of attribution primary and secondary emotions to the in-group and to the out-group. So after this, we coded each information like number of respondents, country, target groups, and means and standard deviations for different emotions: primary emotions, secondary emotions, positive emotions, negative emotions, to the in-group, to the out-group, at all. Positive primary, positive secondary, in different combinations. And we calculated coins D and used our packages like RoboMeta and Metaphor, and meta-regression approach was run including robust variance estimation. Firstly, just descriptive information. We found 40 articles, which included 72 samples, and the total number of respondents was 8,000 people. And I see, and you see that it is crazy, so beautiful number, but it's true. And these respondents were from 90 countries, mostly from the USA. And if we consider the basic descriptive information, just percent of observations, so we can see that secondary emotions are in 70% of observations. In 70% of observations, secondary emotions are attributed to the in-group more than to the out-group, but it is related to secondary positive emotions, not to secondary negative emotions. Secondary negative emotions are attributed to the in-group more only in 40% of observations, but it's just descriptive. Let's talk about coins D. And let's start with the basic theses, 3 theses of infrahumanization theory. The first thesis was confirmed. People attribute the equal number of primary emotions to the in-group and to the out-group. Yes. And secondly, individuals are more likely to attribute secondary emotions to the in-group than to the out-group. Yeah, generally it's true. But when we fix the balance and consider separately secondary positive and secondary negative effects, infrahumanization effect infrahumanization effect works only with secondary positive emotions, not with secondary negative. Also, we found in-group favoritism effect. I highlighted this with green color, and people attribute more positive emotions to the in-group, regardless of the uniqueness of these emotions. So maybe because this group is more likely, more sympathetic, it's our group, in-group. Also, we found familiarity effect and balance effect, because people attribute more emotions regardless of their valence or uniqueness, more emotions at all to the in-group than to the out-group. Maybe because this group is familiar. And people more choose, people more choose for attribution process positive than negative emotions, regardless of the groups, regardless of the uniqueness of these emotions, just choosing more positive emotions, maybe because this is more homogeneous information. And what can we say about this? Why infrahumanization exists on secondary positive but not secondary negative emotions? Bain proposed culture status hypothesis and told that prototypical human characteristics like secondary emotions emphasizes culture achievements, and maybe attribution of secondary emotions to the in-group and to the out-group just reflect information about which country is more developed. And this effect, infrahumanization effect, accompanies other effects like in-group favoritism, violence effect, and maybe we can revise this theory, I don't know. Alliance-based infrahumanization theory on ethnocentrism theory, and firstly consider this effect on ethnic groups. But other researchers after this used different groups, occupational groups, age groups, disability groups, different groups. But maybe if we listen to culture status hypothesis, for example, and the basis of Infrahumanisation theory, maybe we can discuss this effect only in the context of ethnic groups. A lot of moments for discussion. And also some limitations. Authors do not indicate all the effects and use unpowered samples. And maybe authors do not publicate research without significance effects. So publication bias could arise. And the large heterogeneity, there may be some moderators, but we don't check this. So thank you for your attention.
In this talk, I will present 3 studies aiming to investigate how people endorse utilitarian decisions by devaluing and dehumanizing the harmed groups. Although utilitarian decisions enable to maximize the positive outcomes for a greater number of people, they are not entirely satisfactory due to breaking social norms such as not harming. As a result, once people approve these decisions, they may seek out various justification mechanisms. One of those justification mechanisms might be victim derogation. According to the just world belief theory, people tend to believe that the world is a just place if people do the right thing at the right time and place. When confronted with a situation that challenges this knowledge, such as witnessing the innocent people's victimization, they may use various defensive mechanisms such as victim derogation, which involves devaluation or dehumanization of them. Also, according to moral disengagement theory, people also use victim derogation to reduce such sanctions stemming from immoral acts, such as harming others. In line with those theories, previous studies have demonstrated that people defensively dehumanize the targets who are suffering and the victimized group in general when their in-group is responsible for their suffering. Based on the above knowledge, in this study we aim to investigate whether devaluation and dehumanization are defensive mechanisms to endorse utilitarian decisions by defining the alien species as target groups to reduce preconceptions about the target groups. We expected that the sacrificed group would be devalued and dehumanized compared to the saved group. To test this assumption, we conducted 3 experiments. In study 1, we presented a utilitarian decision as a manipulation in a mixed design. We tested whether people devalued and dehumanized the sacrificed group by identifying target group status as a within subjects factor. In second study, the experimental design was improved by adding an accidental harm condition as a control condition in which the outcome was the same, but the action happened accidentally. We also changed the name of the alien species. In study 3, we replicated the second study in a between subject design. The measures were the same across studies. In the experimental condition, we created a vignette similar to the trolley dilemma, wherein a human commander destroyed a space station with 2 million aliens from one species in order to stop an asteroid from hitting a city where 12 million aliens from another species live. In the control conditions of Study 2 and Study 3, the human commander thought they could keep both groups safe, but because of an unexpected accident, 2 million aliens died, but 12 million aliens were still saved. The saved and sacrificed group status of the alien species were counterbalanced. To investigate whether people devalue the sacrificed group, we asked to what extent 4 traits might be typical of those alien species. They were valuable, competent, meaningful, and respectable. Then we measure infrahumanization by asking to what extent the alien species were capable of feeling 8 primary and 8 secondary emotions. The infrahumanization scores were calculated through subtracting the secondary emotions from primary emotions. Mind perception was examined by presenting some mental capacities in 3 different dimensions, which are body, mind, and heart. The body-relevant mental capacities tap into the capability of feeling physical sensations such as expressing pain. The mind-relevant mental capacities include cognitive abilities enabling awareness of the information coming from the environment, and the heart includes some complex feelings and self-regulatory characteristics such as holding beliefs. On a slider ranging from 0 to 100%, participants were asked the extent of the similarity between each alien species and human beings. Finally, participants were asked to judge if the decision was right, blameworthy, immoral, or correct. Participants also made another moral judgment as if both groups were human beings. We found that the harmed group was devalued compared to the saved group, and this was more when the utilitarian decision was given. When dehumanization measures were analyzed, Study 1 and Study 2 found that the interaction between harm type and group status was non-significant, but the main effect of the group status was significant. Study 1 showed that for mind attribution, only body-relevant mental capacities were attributed to the harmed group to a lesser extent than the saved group. Body-relevant mental capacities could tap into the perception of victims' moral patiency. By attributing the body-relevant mental capacities to a lesser extent, people may deny the harmed group's capability of suffering. For direct dehumanization measure, the harmed group was dehumanized through likening to human beings to a lesser extent than the saved group. On the other hand, the results for infrahumanization were non-significant. In Study 2, the harmed group was infrahumanized compared to the saved group. For mind attribution, body-relevant and mind-relevant mental capacities were ascribed to the harmed group to a lesser degree than the saved group. Mind-relevant mental capacities include abilities such as remembering things, sensing temperature, detecting sound, which are tapping into awareness of the information about the environment and employing this knowledge in various contexts. When the body and mind-relevant mental capacities are taken together, it might be said in this study the victimhood of the harmed group was denied in two ways: denying their capability of suffering by attributing body-relevant mental capacities in a lesser degree, and refuting their capability of awareness to what they are exposed to by attributing mind-relevant capacities in a lesser degree. Similar to the first study, the harmed group was likened to human beings less than the saved group. In Study 3, the results were non-significant for all the dehumanization measures. For moral approval, in all studies, we found that people judged the decision as moral in a similar way when groups were alien species and human beings. Study 1 and Study 2 demonstrated that in the presence of direct comparison between saved and harmed groups, the harmed group was dehumanized and devalued compared to the saved group, with some variation in measures of dehumanization. However, when the direct comparison between saved and harmed group was not salient, dehumanization wasn't a justification mechanism, but devaluation still was a justification mechanism to endorse utilitarian decisions. Thank you very much.
So, hello everyone, and welcome to my talk on how people perceive and respond to advice from humans and non-humans. My name is Afroditi, and I'm a second-year PhD student in Professor Lasana Harris's lab. So today, what I'm going to do is to talk about one study under my thesis project that explores how people think about advice generated by artificial intelligence. Now, exploring how people think about AI can be relevant to dehumanization, as this direct comparison of humans to AI can provide us with useful insights into how a non-human target is perceived. And just a note, in the rest of the talk, I will be using the terms AI and AI algorithms interchangeably. Okay, now, what the AI community looks at to evaluate AI can basically be summarized into three things: performance, process, and purpose. performance refers to the competency of AI, and it includes characteristics such as reliability, predictability, and in broader terms, the ability to achieve the specific goals it was designed to achieve. And because it is linked to the ability to achieve specific goals, performance demonstrates this rather task and situation-dependent nature of AI. Process refers to the set of steps and operations that govern the behavior of AI. And here, characteristics such as understandability, transparency, interpretability, and explainability are included. And usually the decision maker will trust an AI if its process can be understood and if it is showing that it is capable of achieving the goals in the current situation. Purpose refers to the intentions and motivations of the AI, and characteristics included here are generally discussed in the realms of AI ethics. Purpose reflects intentionality, and although AI does not exhibit intentionality, it is designed with a purpose, and it embodies the intentionality of its designers. Nevertheless, we know that people may attribute intentionality to AI as it becomes increasingly sophisticated and as it takes on human characteristics. So these three things, these three P's, performance, process, and purpose, are what the AI community is looking at. But these are no different to similar distinctions that other researchers have made when defining the factors that influence trust in automation. They identify performance, process, and purpose as the general basis of trust in automation. And interestingly to us, two of them, purpose and performance, overlap with the dimensions of person perception model from social psychology, the dimension competence and the dimension warmth respectively, which we know play a fundamental role in our perception of humans. So taking all these things into consideration, we hypothesized that similar to person perception, using cues signaling different levels of trait warmth and different levels of trait competence will have an effect on how people perceive AI. So we hypothesized that reliance on advice from an AI in a visual estimation task, attitude towards AI, and the level of trust in AI will vary depending on the kind of information the description of the AI conveyed in terms of purpose, performance, and process. We use purpose of the AI as a cue signaling warmth, and we use performance of the AI as a cue signaling competence. And in addition to those two, we used process as a fluency manipulation. We described the way the AI worked in a simple or a more complicated way. We then measured the three things we see on the right. The first one is a behavioral measure, and the second and third one are self-report measures. So to test our hypothesis, we recruited 135 participants. The experiment had a 2 by 2 by 2 variables repeated measures design, with purpose, performance, and process as our independent variables. The dependent variables were three. Firstly, it was something called weight on advice, which is a ratio used in advice literature to measure advice uptake. The second one was attitude towards the use of the AI. And the third one was the level of trust in the AI. The study was an online study. And in order to incentivize participants in the visual estimation task, we gave them on top of their payment virtual tickets for entering a raffle for every correct estimate they made. And we pre-registered everything. So a few words about the weight on advice before we move on. It is a ratio. It is a ratio that compares the distance of the final estimate from the initial to the distance of the advice from the initial estimate. Typically, we would expect this ratio to be between 0 and 100%. A weight on advice of 0% occurs when a participant completely ignores the advice, whereas a weight on advice of 100% occurs when a participant abandons his or her judgment to match the advice. So when it comes to the experimental procedure itself, participants were asked to evaluate how well each one of 8 competing AIs performed as they assessed them. And that was the cover story that we gave them. To determine how well each AI performed, they saw a brief description of the AI, giving information about its purpose, process, and performance, and then they were asked to do 2 visual estimation tasks. In each visual estimation task, they first saw a picture for a brief display time and were asked to estimate how many objects, humans or non-humans, were depicted. So they were shown, for example, a picture of people sitting in a restaurant, and they had to give their best estimate of how many people were in the picture. Same thing with how many tubes or how many dogs are in the picture. Then they saw the estimate from the AI, and they then were asked to give their final estimate. They basically had to decide whether to adjust their initial estimate to that of the AIs based on how well they thought each AI performed. They did 2 visual estimation tasks per competing AI, and for each AI, they were then redirected to a screen where they were asked to report their attitude and the level of trust in the AI if that AI was available for use. Finally, they were asked to provide their demographic information, thanked for their time, and given details about the raffle. Going over to our results now, when it comes to reliance on advice from AI, a 3-way repeated measures ANOVA with weight on advice as a dependent variable showed that the performance of the AI had a significant effect on reliance on its advice, which indicates that participants adjust more their initial estimate towards the advice from the AI when the AI is described as having a high rather than a low performance. The interaction between performance and process was also significant, and post-hoc dependent t-tests showed that the effect of process was significant only for low-performing AI, with the use of advice increasing when the process of the AI was described in a complex rather than a simple way, a rather counterintuitive result at first sight. And finally, the interaction between purpose and process was significant, and post-hoc dependent t-test here showed that the effect of process was significant only for morally good AI, meaning that for morally good AI, we see that the use of advice increases again when the process is described in a complex rather than in a simple way. We get pretty much the same picture with attitude towards AI, with performance having a significant effect. Here, however, we see purpose also having a significant effect, with a more positive attitude reported when AI has a morally good purpose. Finally, the interaction between both performance and purpose and performance and process are significant, with high-performing AI being perceived more positively for both morally good and morally bad, and for both simple and complex AIs. And the graphs here show the main effect and the interaction effects on average attitude toward AI. Lastly, when it comes to trust in AI, we see an overwhelming effect of performance. So to sum it up, trait competence information manipulated via the description of performance has an effect on reliance on advice from an AI, attitudes towards AI, and trust in AI. Trait warmth information manipulated via the purpose description has an effect only on attitude towards AI. And fluency manipulation introduced through the description of process has an impact on reliance on AI advice for low-performing AI and morally good AI, in a direction that perhaps suggests that people might use this fluency as an indirect metacognitive cue to engage in more analytical system 2 kind of processing, leading them to discount advice less. And I will leave you with some thoughts on non-human agent perception triggered by the results of this study. Previous research on person perception indicates that trait warmth information is used significantly more than competence information, and this is consistent with brain imaging evidence. However, when it comes to non-human agents, and AI in particular, our finding suggests that the human primacy effect of warmth does not seem to hold true. And lastly, black box AI is the opposite to transparent AI, and the AI community should move away from black box AI. However, we must be careful how much information we take away from the description of the non-human agent, as if we take away too much, we might be losing useful side effects of information processing, like the activation of more analytical forms of reasoning triggered by this fluency. And with that, I would like to thank you. And I'm excited, if you are interested in the subject, to talk to you more about it offline. Thank you for your time.
Hello, I'm Jessica Brough. I am a PhD student at the University of Edinburgh, supervised by Holly Brannigan and Hugh Rabagliati. I'm also supervised by Lasana Harris, and this particular project involved a collaboration with Emily Cross and Anna Henschel of the Glasgow University Social Robotics Department. I'm going to be talking to you about descriptions of human-robot interactions and what these can tell us about humanness and animacy. What makes someone human? This is a bit of a big question for a 10-minute talk. Instead, I might narrow things down and reframe the question. What differentiates between the figures in this image, between human and robot? Despite the obvious physical differences, one possible way of answering this question is provided through psycholinguistics. How would someone describe this image? Well, I could make one pretty good guess based off the theory of conceptual accessibility. Developed by Catherine Bock and colleagues, the theory of conceptual accessibility states that speakers tend to construct utterances based on which representations are easier to retrieve from memory and are therefore easier to bring to mind or to conceptualize. An entity's conceptual accessibility is determined by how many relationships it can enter into or predicates that can be ascribed to it. Animacy is one feature of many that can make something more or less conceptually accessible. The more animate something is, the more predicates can be associated with it, or the more it can do, and thus the more accessible it is. So, for instance, a human can do more things, can have more verbs associated with it, and can have more statements made about it than a plant, and so humans are more conceptually accessible than plants. This results in what is known as an animacy bias, where more animate entities tend to be mentioned before less animate entities. So, going back to my original example, if I asked you to describe this image below, I would expect you to talk about Will Smith's character from the film I, Robot first, and Sonny the Robot second. Animacy is a complex, multifaceted concept involving the perception of an entity's mental state, its intentionality, for instance, if it's alive and has self-propelled movement, if it is a machine programmed to execute movements, or how anthropomorphic or close to humanness it is. Gray and Wegner categorise mind perception in two ways. Firstly, agency, the ability to plan and act, and secondly, experience, the ability to sense and feel. They have been able to map where a selection of entities fall on a scale of mind perception, with people generally perceived as having high agency and experience. In comparison, animals tend to be perceived as having lots of experience, but limited agency. Interestingly, they also mapped the mind perception of robots, finding that they are generally perceived as having mid-agency and no experience. Empathy is also central to animacy, and therefore conceptual accessibility, as people are more likely to empathise with an entity that has the ability to experience emotions or feelings, for instance, an abused dog, than with an entity that doesn't experience such things, for example, a wilting flower. All of these elements contribute to assumptions that can be made about the entity's mental state. And when we look to make predictions of language production, specifically during descriptions of events, relative animacy between the entities involved makes for a reliable predictor of what a speaker will mention first. Events involving two entities interacting, also known as dyadic interactions, have been widely tested in the context of animacy. Often, speakers will show an animacy bias to mention the most animate entity first and the less animate entity second, for example saying the man is running away from the dog rather than the other way round. The animacy bias has been tested on a range of entities, but as of yet it has not been tested on human-robot interactions. These make for an interesting case study because of the tendency for engineers of social robots to create them in the image of humanness. However, crucially, social robots may be human-like, but they are still not human. We perceive them as having less agency and experience than people, less intentionality, we empathise with them differently, and so, based on the theory of conceptual accessibility, we would expect speakers to show a human-first bias, mentioning the human first and the robot second when describing dyadic interactions. We set out to test the strength of the animacy bias in relation to human-robot interactions in two experiments. The first experiment involved two steps. We began by teaching participants the names of 4 humans and 4 robots with a memory game. Then we showed participants images of humans and robots interacting, providing a fragment of a description and asking participants to use these names to complete the description. These sentences were designed so that participants could reasonably mention either the human or the robot first as sentence subject or second as direct object. We then measured who participants mentioned first and predicted that they would show a bias towards mentioning the human first and the robot second. Importantly, we also varied the stimuli for anthropomorphism. On half the trials, the human was interacting with an anthropomorphic humanoid robot, and on the other half, the human was interacting with a less anthropomorphic Lego robot. We predicted that the human-first bias would be strongest where the animacy disparity or the distance in animacy between the two entities was greatest, so on human Lego trials. And indeed, participants showed a robust tendency to mention the human first, doing so on 74% of trials. However, although we did also find a main effect of anthropomorphism, this was in the opposite direction to what we had expected. Participants were more likely to show a human first bias on trials depicting human-humanoid pairs, where the animacy disparity was smallest, rather than on trials depicting human Lego pairs. In our second experiment, we wanted to see if we could replicate these results. We also took this opportunity to add a new condition in which we attempted to reverse the perceived animacy hierarchy of the humans and robots. We wanted to see if by encouraging participants to view the robots as more animate than the humans, we could reverse the human first bias so that participants would mention the robot first. This time, before doing the memory and language tasks, participants first read a short story. We assigned them to 2 different narrative conditions. In the human-oriented condition, the humans were presented as highly animate beings with personalities, desires, emotions, and so on, while the robot group was presented as being much less animate clones with limited abilities. This condition was also used as a replication of the first experiment. Participants in the robot-oriented condition read the same story but with some crucial differences. Here, the robot group were presented as the highly animate beings, while the humans were presented as the much less animate clones. In a post-study questionnaire, all participants gave ratings of the human and robot groups for perceived agency, experience, and empathy. We later used these ratings as predictors of mention order. We also used items from Harris and Fiske to measure the extent to which participants dehumanized the human group to determine if those in the robot-oriented condition had in fact viewed the human group as being less human than participants in the human-oriented condition. Our results showed that they had, and we also used these scores later as predictors of mention order. The key analysis from this experiment was who participants mentioned first. So in this graph, anything above the dotted line indicates a human first bias. And overall, we did indeed find a robust human first bias again. However, we did also find a significant main effect of narrative condition. Participants in the robot-oriented condition who had read about highly animate robot figures and much less animate human figures were much less likely to mention the human first than participants in the human-oriented condition. So, although we did not outright reverse the human first bias in this condition, we did significantly reduce its likelihood. Interestingly, we also replicated the effect of anthropomorphism from experiment 1. Participants were more likely to show human first bias on trials depicting human-humanoid pairs than on trials depicting human Lego pairs. Next, we asked to what extent could mention order be predicted by relative ratings of animacy between the human and robot groups. On the graph to the left, anything above 0 indicates higher empathy ratings for the humans than the robots, and anything under 0 indicates higher empathy ratings for the robots. Our results showed that participants were more likely to mention the robot first if they empathized more with the robots than with the humans. We also found that participants, regardless of which narrative condition they'd been assigned to, were more likely to mention the robot first if they demonstrated greater dehumanization. To summarize, speakers show a human-first bias when describing human-robot interactions. Our manipulation in the second experiment tells us that perceptions of animacy can be altered through narrative, but ours was not quite strong enough to outright reverse the human-first effect. Regarding our unexpected findings on the effect of anthropomorphism, we have some potential explanations. It's possible that we were seeing effects similar to what is known as semantic similarity. The humans and humanoids would have been more conceptually related than the humans and the Lego robots, and therefore harder to pull apart or differentiate between, so to speak. This may have resulted in a stronger human-first bias to relieve the cognitive load. We may also consider that participants could have been less clear about the capabilities of the Lego robots. Although they were presented as adult-sized beings, people are generally familiar with Lego-looking objects as inanimate toys. Lastly, another potential explanation is that participants viewing human-humanoid interactions were experiencing effects of the uncanny valley defined by discomfort or eeriness upon perceiving a clearly non-human property or behaviour. Perhaps this eeriness increased the likelihood of human-first bias. So, experiment 2 provides some really important information about what differentiates humans from robots. Finding that the human-first bias could be reversed so that people mention a robot first if they empathise more with the robot, or have viewed the human as less human, tells us that these factors, which are arguably related, are central to our perceptions of not only conceptual accessibility, but what makes someone human. Thanks very much for listening.
Hi, I'm Rebecca, and I'm a first-year PhD student at the Graduate School of Systemic Neurosciences in Munich. However, the study that I'm going to share, I conducted together with the Boundaries of Social Cognition Lab at UCL in London. And in this study, we examined how we switch between a humanized and a dehumanized perception. Since we're all experts in the field, we all know that particularly members of negatively stereotyped outgroups are often perceived as less than human, without their own conscious, cognitive, and emotional experiences, which we also refer to as dehumanization. Unfortunately, this mode of perception might actually lead to reduced motivation to actually help these deprived outgroups. Nevertheless, in certain contexts, dehumanization might actually be beneficial. For instance, in this study, Harris and colleagues found that when participants were asked to purchase players in an economic labor market, where players served as commodities, as it often occurs in sport leagues, for example, participants responded with reduced activity in the social cognition network, particularly the MPFC, even though these participants were clearly in a social context. And this brain response has previously been associated with dehumanized perception. In other words, these findings show that dehumanization is not reserved for evil people, but we all have the mental capacities to dehumanize one another if the social context encourages it. In fact, we are constantly required to switch between a humanized and a dehumanized orientation toward others to adapt to changing context. But the neuromechanisms that underlie this switch still remain unclear. Actually, great progress has been made in understanding the neuromechanisms that underlie switching between different non-social contexts, but researchers have not yet addressed switching between different social contexts. But this study by Riek and Egner might provide first insights. It examined the switch between affective and non-affective task sets. And therefore, researchers presented to participants images of faces and asked participants to indicate the individual's mood or gender. And participants either repeated the same task, the mood or the gender task, or alternated between the two tasks. And researchers found that response times were longer when participants alternated between the two tasks compared to when they repeated the same task for both the gender and the emotional expression task, which is also referred to as the switch cost. At the same time, the researchers found that the switch between these two different tasks is implemented by an external top-down cognitive mechanism mediated by the DLPFC and the ACC. And importantly, these findings are in line with previous studies on task switching in non-social contexts, which might provide first insights that switching between different social contexts involves the same cognitive mechanisms as switching between different non-social contexts, since emotional expressions contribute to our understanding of others in social situations. However, this study only focused on visual cues, and social decision-making involves many more complex factors beyond visual cues. During social decision-making, we take into account a range of social information to then actually infer information that have not been directly stated. Therefore, the main objective of our study was to identify the neuromechanisms that underlie the switch between humanized and dehumanized perception based on social inferences, in addition to visual cues. And to address this research question, we, prior to the experiment, provided participants with several color images of individuals. Additionally, we provided participants with one sentence describing each individual's financial competence and one sentence providing the individual's social warmth. And we asked participants to familiarize themselves with these individuals based on these descriptions prior to the study. On the day of testing, participants were then presented with these different images. And in order to operationalize humanized perception, participants were asked to indicate whether they would approach or avoid this individual in a social context. To operationalize dehumanized perception, we asked participants to indicate whether they would approach or avoid the individual in a financial context. And these two tasks encourage participants to actually make social inferences prior to a social decision. The two different tasks were presented in form of stay and switch trials. In stay trials, participants repeated the same task, while in switch trials, participants alternated between the two different tasks. We also added a control condition where we asked participants to indicate the individual's mood or age. And this control condition should encourage participants to only consider the visual cues, as has been done in the study by Riek and Ekman. And indeed, we found that when participants only considered the visual cues, their response times were longer in switch compared to stay trials. However, when participants were encouraged to make social inferences prior to the social decision, we did not find a switch cost, which suggests that switching between different social contexts, if we actually make social inferences, is not implemented by an external top-down cognitive mechanism, which usually causes the switch cost. But of course, we also hear what is actually happening in the brain. And therefore, we repeated the exact same task, but this time we recorded EEG signals. And we also got rid of the control condition. We first of all looked at the 170 amplitude, which has been associated with social cognition, and larger and 170 amplitudes have been found as a response to less human faces, such as misaligned, inverted, or scrambled faces, which makes it a great index to measure dehumanized perception. And indeed, we found larger amplitudes or more negative amplitudes as a response to the financial context, which indicates that, first of all, the two different tasks were actually perceived as two different tasks, and secondly, that the financial context induces a dehumanized perception. We also looked at the P400 amplitude, which has been associated with task switching in non-social contexts. More precisely, it is thought to reflect the interplay between the DLPFC and the ACC. However, in our study, we did not find a significant difference between stay and switch trials with regard to the P400 amplitude, which supports our behavioral findings, suggesting that task switching in social context is not implemented by an external top-down cognitive mechanism, but possibly by a different mechanism. In sum, we found that the social and financial tasks in our study are actually perceived as two different tasks, and that the financial and the social task induced a dehumanized and humanized mode of perception respectively. However, it seems that the switch between these two different modes of perceptions is not implemented by an external top-down cognitive process that occurs after the stimulus identification phase and is mediated by the ACC and the EPFC, but possibly by an alternative mechanism. For you to take away, I have that it seems that the control of social cognition is distinct to the control of other previously researched cognitive systems, but how remains unclear. Thank you very much for your attention.